What if I told you that everything you believed in while watching beautiful costume dramas is not true? Behind the glossy facade of British estates lay not just work, but a complex mechanism that ground human destinies into dust for the sake of a perfect picture. We are used to seeing luxurious balls and hearing the rustle of silk dresses, but real life at home did not take place in the drawing rooms, but in the damp corridors and stuffy kitchens. It was a world where the walls really did have ears, and the slightest mistake could cost a person their only means of livelihood. There was a strict army here, where discipline was stricter than on a military parade ground, and hierarchy was observed with religious fanaticism. Each servant was a cog in a huge machine whose task was to make the master's lives as easy and unobtrusive as possible. Watch the video to the end to find out how a system of invisible people maintained the splendor of the world's greatest empire and what it really cost them. I am about to reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Victorian mansion. The butler was not at all the good-natured servant serving tea, as he is portrayed in books, but was in fact the CEO of a huge corporation with unlimited power. His day began long before dawn, when the house was still deep in sleep, and his every move was honed by years of practice. He was responsible not only for order, but also for the safety of the family's main treasure, the silverware, which was worth a fortune. Every night he personally counted every fork and spoon, locking them in a special safe in his storeroom, which often served as his bedroom. This man lived in constant tension because the loss of even a small item would leave an indelible stain on his reputation. He was the only man in the house who was allowed to have a family, but even this right often remained theoretical due to his schedule. The butler kept the keys to the wine cellar, which made him the guardian of yet another strategic resource of the estate. The process of decanting wine became a real ritual, requiring knowledge of chemistry and incredible steadiness of hand by candlelight. He had to know the serving temperature of each drink so as not to disgrace his master in front of distinguished guests. A mistake in the choice of wine could cost the master his social status and the butler his job. His duties also included a more delicate task, filtering visitors who knocked on the front door. He had to determine the status of a guest at a glance and decide whether they were worthy of disturbing the hosts or should be sent away. This required subtle psychological insight and knowledge of all the gossip of high society in order to avoid making a fatal mistake. The butler was also the chief personnel officer, hiring and firing footmen, and his word in the lower world was law, not subject to discussion. The most unusual aspect of his power was the right to perks, candle stubs and empty bottles, which he could sell. It was a legalized way of earning extra money, which allowed butlers to save up for their own small pub in their old age. He never wore a livery, unlike the footman, always remaining in a strict black suit that emphasized his special status. His manners were a mirror image of his master's, sometimes even more refined and restrained. The butler's relationship with the housekeeper resembled a Cold War between two superpowers confined to the same building. They divided their spheres of influence, strictly ensuring that no one crossed the invisible boundaries of their authority. At the servants' table, the butler always sat at the head, and no one dared to begin eating before him. He even controlled the topics of conversation at dinner, suppressing any gossip that could damage the reputation of the house. This position required a complete renunciation of one's own personality in order to serve the interests of the family for whom he worked. He knew all the family secrets, saw all the financial ups and downs, but was obliged to keep silent. His face always had to remain an impenetrable mask, no matter what was happening around him. At the end of their careers, many butlers remained lonely people who had devoted their entire lives to someone else's home. I wonder how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world, since servants were everywhere. Where are you from? Do you agree with the arguments presented that the butler's power was absolute? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next reviews. Are you ready to learn the truth about the woman who was feared more than the Lord himself? The housekeeper, or Mrs., as she was called regardless of her marital status, was the rightful mistress of all the female staff in the interior decoration. A heavy bunch of keys always jingled on her belt, symbolizing her complete control over the storerooms with linen, spices, and tea. She decided how much sugar would be issued to the kitchen and when the expensive linen sheets in the guest room should be changed. Her authority extended to every corner of the house, and not a speck of dust could escape her attentive and stern gaze. Every morning began with an inspection of the rooms, where the housekeeper checked the quality of the cleaning with the meticulousness of a military auditor. She would run her white glove over the highest shelves or look under the carpets in search of the slightest disorder. If the work was not done well enough, the maid had to redo everything, often at the expense of her own sleep time. The housekeeper was also responsible for the moral character of the maids, strictly monitoring their behavior and appearance. Any hint of flirting or inappropriate clothing was punished immediately and mercilessly, up to and including dismissal without recommendation. Housekeepers were often women who had risen from the bottom, working their way up from simple maids to the top of the hierarchy. This experience made them tough and demanding, as they were well aware of all the tricks and ruses of the junior staff. She had her own separate room where she could drink tea from a porcelain cup and keep her accounts in relative peace and quiet. This privacy was her privilege, emphasizing the distance between her and the other servants. The housekeeper's relationship with the lady of the house was complex and based on a delicate balance of trust and subordination. The lady relied on her for everything, often without even knowing how her own house functioned. The housekeeper became a buffer between the lady's whims and the harsh reality of the servant's work. Sometimes she could gently steer the mistress's decisions in the right direction, using her authority and experience. The housekeeper's clothing was always austere, dark, made of high-quality fabric, without unnecessary embellishments, but commanding respect. She did not wear an apron like ordinary maids, which visually separated her from physical labor. Her entire appearance spoke of stability, reliability, and unwavering loyalty to the traditions of the house. Even the housekeeper's gait was special, confident, measured, audible from afar thanks to the rustle of her skirts and the jingle of her keys. This woman had effectively sacrificed her personal life in order to maintain perfect order in someone else's home. She became a mother to the young maids, albeit a very strict one, and the guardian of a hearth that did not belong to her. Her life was devoted to service, and often her only family were the other servants and masters. Do you think it was fair to place such responsibility on one person, depriving them of their personal life? In the next chapter, you will learn what tricks male servants use to meet the beauty standards of the time. Guess how long it took to create the perfect footman? It was one of the few professions in history where a man's appearance was his main and sometimes only asset. Footmen served as living interior decorations, selected for their height and stature, as carefully as curtains or statues. Tall stature was valued incredibly highly, and every extra inch could literally mean an increase in salary. There were even special pay scales where an additional fee was paid for every 2 centimeters of height. But nature was not always kind to candidates, and this is where tricks and ruses came into play. If a footman's calves were not muscular enough to be shown off in stockings and breeches, he would use pads. Special cotton or fabric pads were placed inside the stockings to create the perfect leg silhouette. If such a pad shifted during a reception, it could cause a huge scandal and immediate dismissal. This forced footmen to move with extreme caution, turning every movement into a smooth dance. The second duty that made their lives a trial was the need to powder their hair with a special white powder. This mixture was made from flour and lard. It was sticky, smelled unpleasant, and caused terrible discomfort. In order not to stain their costumes, footmen had to wear special cones over their faces during the powdering procedure. Their heads itched, their skin became irritated, but they were obliged to stand motionless, like marble statues. The footman's job was not only to stand beautifully in the hall or open doors for guests. They carried heavy buckets of coal to the upper floors, trying not to get dust on their immaculate liveries. They had to balance heavy trays laden with fragile porcelain as they made their way through narrow corridors. The physical strain was enormous, but showing fatigue or sweating was strictly forbidden by etiquette. The footman's uniform cost a fortune and belonged to the owners of the house, who spared no expense on gold braid. Often, the costumes were tailored so tightly to emphasize the figure that any sudden movements were impossible. The footman felt trapped in a golden cage, where every breath was constrained by stiff fabric. They were actors on a stage playing the role of silent and beautiful performers of someone else's will. The competition for the position of first footman was fierce, as it was a stepping stone to the coveted position of butler. They schemed, undermined each other, and tried to stand out in front of their masters in any way possible. But for most, their careers ended when they began to lose their former fitness or started going bald. An aging footman became useless to anyone, losing his value as a decorative element. Their life was a strange mixture of hard physical labor and the need to maintain a glamorous appearance. They saw luxury at arm's length, but could never truly touch it. This gave rise to a particularly cynical attitude towards their masters, hidden behind a mask of polite indifference. Night duty was a particular torment, when the footman had to sleep on a folding bed right in the corridor. He had to be ready to jump up at the first call, even if it was at 3 in the morning. Sleep was light and intermittent, and chronic sleep deprivation was their constant companion. On weekends, they tried to shed their livery and become ordinary people, but professional deformation often remained forever. They were recognized by their posture and the way they held their hands, even when they were dressed in simple clothes. They were the elite among servants, but remained nothing more than beautiful furniture for their masters. It would be great if you could like this video, so we know that you are interested in such historical details. What if I told you that hell on earth existed, and it was at the very bottom of the Victorian household hierarchy? The scullery maid was invisible even to the other servants, a creature whose life was spent in steam and dampness. Her day began before everyone else's, while it was still dark, so that she could light the stove before the cook arrived. She was responsible for cleaning, washing, and preparing the entire kitchen before the real work began. Her main enemy was the huge mountain of copper pots and pans that had to be scrubbed until they shone like mirrors. Instead of soft sponges, they used sand, soda, and stiff brushes that corroded the skin of their hands to deep cracks. The dishwasher's hands were always red, swollen from the icy water, and covered with unhealed abrasions. She spent hours bent over deep stone sinks, inhaling the smells of grease and lye. The dishwasher's position was so low that she was often forbidden to even be seen by the older servants, let alone the masters. She ate leftovers standing in a corner because she was not always allowed to sit at the common table. Her sleeping place was often in the smallest and coldest room, sometimes just on a folding bed in the pantry. She had no rights, only an endless list of duties that never ended. She was also responsible for preparing vegetables. She peeled mountains of potatoes, carrots, and onions for the master's dinners. Mountains of peelings and dirty water were her constant companions from morning until late at night. She was required to work quickly and efficiently, and any mistake could result in a beating or deprivation of food. The cook, the king of the kitchen, often took his irritation out on her, and she was the perfect target for his anger. The dishwasher's clothes were the simplest and coarsest, made of fabric that could withstand constant washing and dirt. She wore heavy wooden shoes to keep her feet dry on the always wet stone floor of the dishwashing room. Humidity was her constant companion, causing rheumatism and lung disease at a young age. Despite the terrible conditions, this job was the only chance for many village girls to avoid starvation. They endured humiliation and hard labor in the hope that one day they would be promoted to kitchen maid. It was a dream of dry clothes and the chance to see sunlight, not just sooty walls. Dishwashers rarely went outside. Their world was limited to four walls in the backyard, where they cleaned garbage cans. They were isolated from society with no time for friends, hobbies, or education. Their lives were a cycle of hard labor and short, restless sleep. Often, it was the dishwashers who were assigned the dirtiest jobs, including plucking poultry and gutting fish. The smell of raw meat and blood clung to their skin and hair, making them outcasts even among their own people. They were the foundation on which all the comforts of home rested, but a foundation that no one wanted to notice. Their fates were often tragic due to poor health and a complete lack of prospects outside the service system. Many died young or were crippled by the heavy loads they had to carry. This was the price paid by the most vulnerable for the luxurious dinners of the aristocracy. Do you think such a cruel hierarchy was justified by the need to maintain order in a large house? In the next chapter, you will learn how the system that forced servants to run around the house like invisible people worked. The communication system in a large Victorian house was a true engineering marvel of its time, designed for complete control. On the wall in the servants' hallway hung a huge board with dozens of bells, each corresponding to a specific room. Each bell had its own size and, accordingly, its own unique tone, which the servants were required to distinguish by ear. An experienced footman or maid could tell from a single note whether they were being summoned to the living room, the ladies' bedroom, or the library. Pendulums swung beneath the bells, continuing to move for some time after the bell was rung, indicating the source of the signal. The system of bells was an invisible leash that connected the servants to their masters at any time of the day. The sound of the bell triggered a conditioned reflex. One had to drop everything and immediately rush to the call. Ignoring the bell or delaying was considered a gross violation of discipline and could result in a fine. Servants lived in constant anticipation of this sharp sound, which could ring out in the middle of dinner or late at night. Laying the system of rods and wires connecting the rooms to the kitchen was a very difficult task during the construction of the mansion. Copper wires ran through walls, under floors, and behind ceilings, forming the nervous system of the house. This allowed the owners to summon the servants without raising their voices or leaving their armchairs by the fireplace. For the masters, it was the height of comfort. For the servants, it was a symbol of their complete lack of freedom. Servants had to appear in the room silently and unnoticed, as if materializing out of thin air immediately after the bell rang. There were special hidden doors and staircases that the staff used to move around without crossing paths with their masters. The architecture of the house was designed to separate the flow of movement of the masters and those who served them. There were often inscriptions on the board with bells, but in the hustle and bustle of the day, one had to rely on hearing and visual memory. Newcomers often got confused in this cacophony of sounds, panicking and running to the wrong room. The old-timers, on the other hand, could unerringly determine even the mood of the owner by the way he pulled the bell cord. A sharp, insistent ring meant anger or urgency, and then the servants literally flew down the corridors. A weak, uncertain ring could come from the room of a sick person or a guest who was reluctant to disturb the staff. This acoustic psychology was an important part of survival in the house, helping to prepare for what awaited behind the door. The bell system deprived servants of their right to privacy and rest, making them available 24 hours a day. Even when in their rooms or eating, they always kept their ears open, waiting for a call. This created an atmosphere of constant tension from which it was impossible to escape. Sometimes, for fun or by mistake, guests would pull the cord without realizing the commotion it would cause downstairs. Servants were obliged to respond to any signal, even if it was false or accidental. Their time and energy did not belong to them. They were completely at the mercy of the mechanism. In later times, electric bells began to appear, which changed the nature of the sound, but not the essence of the system. They became even more insistent and reliable, finally cementing the master's power over the servant's time. In this case, technological progress only improved the instruments of control. The bell system was a symbol that a servant was not a person, but a function activated by pressing a button. This depersonalized relationships, reducing them to a stimulus response pattern. The bell became the voice of the house that never fell silent. Are you ready for the shocking truth about who knew all of a lady's secrets? The personal maid, or lady's maid, occupied a special position in the hierarchy, being dangerously close to her mistress. She did not do the dirty work around the house. Her job was to take care of her mistress's wardrobe, hairstyle, and appearance. She was the only one who saw the lady without her corset, without her makeup, in moments of weakness and vulnerability. This intimate closeness gave her power, but also put her in an extremely precarious position, dependent on her mistress's mood. Her day was filled with endless washing of the finest lace, repairing dresses, and cleaning delicate fabrics. All this required enormous patience, and most importantly, a deep knowledge of how to handle expensive materials brought from different countries. Thin muslin dresses or intricate silk outfits could be ruined by a single wrong move, and the responsibility for the safety of the wardrobe fell entirely on her. The maid had to be able to work quickly to keep up with the rhythm of her mistress's life. Every morning she began by inspecting the outfits that the lady might need. She had to be knowledgeable about fashion and know which styles were considered modern and which were outdated. The maid studied magazine engravings and listened to the conversations of fashionistas to understand what would be considered stylish in the coming season. The ability to style complex hairstyles was not just a skill, but part of her professional identity, because each hairstyle could create a first impression of the mistress. She knew how to hide hair under wigs, how to pin curls, and which oils help maintain shine. She also had to know the secrets of stain removal, because the hostess's embarrassment could cost her hours of extra work. The personal maid often wore her mistress's dresses, which set her apart from the other servants. These dresses might have been made of expensive fabrics and kept in good condition, but they still remained a symbol of her belonging to a world she could never truly enter. The other servants envied her because she looked a little more elegant than they did, but this outward privilege hid an inner dependence. She wore clothes that reminded her that she stood between two worlds. This position often caused misunderstanding and alienation. She knew about the love letters hidden in boxes, about the financial problems and hidden ailments of the mistress. The maid heard conversations that were not meant for strangers' ears, simply because she was nearby. Her silence was part of the contract, and any careless word could ruin her career forever. She became a living diary in which the darkest secrets of the aristocratic bedroom were recorded. Often a strange friendship developed between them, distorted by the inequality of their positions. Sometimes this friendship turned into a subtle emotional connection that neither side could admit aloud. The mistress could confide in the maid what she did not even confide in her own family, because she understood that the maid had no right to betray her. But the maid always remembered that any closeness could result in accusations of insolence. Their relationship existed on the edge of trust and caution, and that edge never completely disappeared. The maid had to have boundless patience, standing on her feet for hours while her mistress chose her outfit. She helped change hairstyles several times a day if the mistress was going to a reception or a ball. Her work required composure and complete emotional neutrality, no matter how capricious her mistress was. She endured outbursts of anger and tears, remaining calm and professional. Her hands had to be gentle and dexterous to tighten corsets and fasten endless rows of small buttons. Sometimes the corset required tremendous strength, and the maid learned to do it quickly so as not to cause unnecessary discomfort. She memorized which outfits her mistress liked best and tried to guess her mood in advance. Sometimes the maid was the only person who could calm the lady before an important reception. Her duties included not only service, but also support. That is why many mistresses valued their maids above any other servant. Her room was often located next to the mistress's bedroom so that she could come to her aid at the first call. This meant that she could not fully rest because she was always listening to see if her mistress would call her. Her personal space dissolved, turning her life into an extension of someone else's. All her furniture fit into a small room where there was no room for luxury or privacy. She lived in the reflected light of someone else's luxury without a destiny of her own. Sometimes the night calls were related to illness, anxiety, or the lady's sudden whims. The maid had to always look composed, even if she had only slept for a couple of hours. Her work had no clear schedule and depended on the condition of her mistress. Such a life gradually blurred the boundaries between personal time and service, and many maids lost their sense of self. Traveling with her employers was another part of her job. It seemed like a privilege, but in reality it turned out to be a difficult ordeal. Packing huge trunks required hours of careful work and precise knowledge of what the mistress might need on the road. Caring for dresses while traveling was more difficult because the fabrics suffered from dampness, dust, and constant movement. She saw the world from the window of a carriage or train, but she could never allow herself to relax. In unfamiliar hotels, the maid always lived in conditions far worse than her mistress. She had to adapt to unfamiliar rooms, poor lighting, and a lack of familiar tools. Each move was a new test of her professionalism, and despite this, she had to remain flawless. Her work was invisible but extremely important. The other servants often disliked personal maids, considering them spies and informers. They felt that the maids were too close to their mistresses and could therefore report any discontent among the servants. As a result, personal maids found themselves between two worlds and did not belong to either of them. They were too refined for the kitchen, but not noble enough for the drawing room. This loneliness became part of their profession. Sometimes the tension between the servants spilled over into hidden animosity, gossip, and mistrust. The maid tried to stay out of it so as not to give rise to conflict, but rumors still spread because her special position was obvious. So she became a stranger in her own home, and this internal exile often accompanied her throughout her life. A maid's skill was determined by how young and fresh her mistress looked. She was an artist, creating an image that could change society's attitude towards a lady. It was thanks to her skill that ladies looked flawless at balls, receptions, and in family portraits. The mistress's success was also her professional triumph, and she was proud of the moments when her work was visible to the world. However, the praise always went to the lady, not to the person behind the image. The maid learned to rejoice in someone else's success while remaining in the shadows. She knew that society would never know her name, even if she put her heart and soul into creating an elegant image. Such invisibility became the norm, but an inner sense of achievement still helped her to continue working. However, when the mistress grew old or died, the personal maid found herself in a vulnerable position. Her future became uncertain because the new owners could dismiss her without explanation. All her skills were tied to one particular woman, and the transition to another was not easy. Sometimes she was taken into a new family out of habit, but more often than not, she had to look for work again. This could result in years of instability. Even if a maid found a new mistress, she had to start from scratch. She had to rebuild trust, learn tastes, habits, and personalities. It was difficult emotional work that required patience. She found herself again on the border between intimacy and subordination, and each time she risked repeating her previous fate. The position of a personal maid was a golden cage with soft bars, but still a cage. She sacrificed her youth, her personal time, and part of her identity to be the shadow of another woman. Her life depended on the woman she served and her whims. The heart of a Victorian mansion was the kitchen, a place of unbearable heat, noise, and constant stress. At the head of this kingdom was the chef, often French or an experienced cook whose authority was unquestionable. Here the air temperature could reach tropical jungle levels due to the constantly burning huge coal stoves. The cook worked in conditions that today would be considered hazardous to health, spending hours near open flames. Preparing a 12-course dinner party was a complex logistical operation requiring the precision of an army maneuver. The dishes had to be served in strict sequence, perfectly hot despite the distance to the dining room. Any delay or cold sauce was a disaster for which the chef was personally responsible. He conducted an orchestra of kitchen maids, assistants, and dishwashers, shouting orders through the steam and smoke. Copper utensils, the pride of the kitchen, required special care and attention, as poorly tinned copper could poison the food. The cooks constantly monitored the condition of the utensils because the lives of the owners literally depended on it. Huge spits with meat had to be rotated for hours, and for this, special spit dogs, or the labor of the youngest servants, were often used. There was a strict hierarchy in the kitchen, from the head chef to the girl who cleaned the vegetables. Everyone knew their place and their task, and moving up to the next level took years of hard work. The chef jealously guarded his secrets and recipes, not rushing to share them with his subordinates. It was a closed guild community with its own laws and traditions. The smells of food were not supposed to penetrate the living quarters of the house, so the kitchen was often designed with a sophisticated ventilation system. But the kitchen workers themselves were thoroughly saturated with these smells, carrying the aroma of fat and spices on their skin. This was another marker that separated them from the clean servants of the upper floors. Purchasing food was another area of responsibility for the cook, and this opened up opportunities for kickbacks from merchants. Butchers and grocers paid cooks a percentage for ordering goods from them. This was a common corruption scheme, which the owners often turned a blind eye to if the food was tasty. Working in the kitchen required tremendous physical strength, lifting cast iron pots, cutting up carcasses, kneading dough. Cooks suffered from varicose veins, burns, and back problems, but continued to work through the pain. Their hands were their main tool, covered with scars from knives and burns. Despite the hard work, cooks were among the highest-paid servants in the house. Their skills were valued, and aristocrats were willing to fight and overpay for a good chef. A delicious meal was the main entertainment and a way to demonstrate status for the Victorian elite. Breakfast, lunch, tea, dinner, late supper. The cooking conveyor belt never stopped for a minute. The cook had to be imaginative so that the menu would not bore the picky masters. It was an art created in hellish conditions for the sake of a moment's pleasure at the table. The kitchen was a world of fire and steam, where culinary masterpieces were created at the expense of the health of those who prepared them. It was a hot spot in the cold structure of the estate, full of passion, shouting, and the clanging of knives. In a house filled with jewelry, antiques, and expensive items, the sword of Damocles of suspicion always hung over the servants. The owners were constantly afraid of theft, and any missing item was first searched for in the servants' rooms. The servants lived in an atmosphere of presumed guilt, where they constantly had to prove their honesty. This created a tense psychological environment where every sidelong glance could be interpreted as a sign of a guilty conscience. There was a strict system of control over the consumption of food, candles, and even stationery. Tea and sugar, which were expensive commodities, were kept under lock and key, with the keys held by the housekeeper. Any attempt to take an extra piece of sugar was considered theft and punished by dismissal. The servants knew they were being watched and tried not to give the slightest cause for suspicion. Dismissal without a reference for suspected theft was tantamount to a social death sentence. Without a character reference from their previous place of work, it was almost impossible to find a new job. People found themselves on the street without a means of subsistence, and often the only option left was a workhouse or a life of crime. The fear of losing a reference was a powerful deterrent. Sometimes employers would set traps, deliberately leaving small coins or jewelry in prominent places to test the honesty of their staff. The servants were well aware of these tests and avoided the forgotten items, afraid to even touch them while cleaning. It was a humiliating game of cat and mouse that destroyed trust between people. Theft did occur, but most often it was petty theft of food or alcohol, caused by meager rations. Serious thefts of jewelry were rare, as it was extremely difficult for a servant to sell such goods. However, collective responsibility often meant that everyone suffered for the misdeeds of one. Servants' personal belongings could be searched at any time without warning. They had no right to privacy, and their chests and cupboards were open for inspection. A piece of lace or ribbon found there that resembled that of the mistress could become evidence. Guests whose belongings could also disappear caused particular tension. If a guest's brooch disappeared, the entire staff of the host's house came under suspicion. It was a stain on the reputation of the entire estate, and the culprit was sought with particular zeal in order to save the master's honor. Some servants, on the contrary, became fanatically honest. Proud that they were trusted with the keys, they turned into watchdogs of their master's property, watching their colleagues more closely than the masters themselves. This divided the staff, creating mutual distrust and denunciations. The system was designed to minimize temptation, but it also created an atmosphere of fear. Servants could never relax, knowing that any accident could be interpreted against them. Honesty was not just a virtue, but a condition for survival. This constant fear of being falsely accused shaped the character of the servants, making them secretive and cautious. They learned to be invisible not only physically, but also in their actions, so as not to attract unnecessary attention. Living under the microscope of suspicion was a heavy burden. The servants had virtually no free time. Their lives belonged entirely to the house, but there were rare hours of rest. Usually it was one day a month and half of Sunday when they could leave the mansion. These short periods of time were worth their weight in gold and were planned with great care. The servants put on their best going-out clothes to feel like free citizens for at least a couple of hours. During these hours, they could visit relatives, go to church, or simply stroll through the park. It was an opportunity to breathe the air of freedom, talk to people outside the circle of servants, and see a different life. Young girls dreamed of meeting a suitor, but the rules of relationships were extremely strict. Most employers forbade maids from having followers, suitors who came to the house. If a maid wanted to get married, it almost always meant the end of her career and dismissal. Therefore, many put their personal lives on hold indefinitely, remaining spinsters for the sake of a piece of bread. Secret romances did happen, but they had to be carefully hidden, risking everything. Meetings at the back door or quick glances in church were the height of romance. In the evenings after work, the servants gathered in the servants' room, a special common room for staff. Here they could mend clothes, play cards, or play musical instruments if they had any. It was a time for socializing, when the hierarchy softened a little and people could just talk. Reading newspapers, often old ones taken from their employers, was a window to the wider world. The limited space in the bedrooms did not allow for many personal belongings or hobbies. All of a servant's possessions had to fit into a single chest, which they moved from place to place. Therefore, their leisure activities were simple and unpretentious, requiring no equipment. Handicrafts were the most popular activity for women, allowing them to decorate their modest homes. Going to the pub was a privilege reserved for male servants, while women were expected to uphold morality and avoid places of ill repute. For a footman or coachman, a pint of beer was a way to relieve stress after a hard day. But alcohol abuse was one of the most common reasons for dismissal. Servants created their own small communities, a kind of family to replace their real ones. They supported each other, shared news, and helped each other in difficult times. These bonds were strong, cemented by a shared fate and common hardships. Vacation was a concept almost unknown to most servants of that era. They worked for years without a break, as long as their health permitted. Freedom was only a short dream for them, from which they always had to wake up to the ringing of a bell. These rare moments, when they were not servants but simply people, were the fuel that kept them going. The hope that someday they would be able to save money and live their own lives warmed their hearts. What awaited a servant at the end of his long and difficult career? Old age was the most terrifying specter that haunted every worker in a Victorian household. There was no pension system, and an old man's well-being depended entirely on the mercy of his former masters or his own savings. Many aristocrats considered it their duty to take care of their loyal servants by providing them with a small house on the estate and a modest allowance. This was the ideal scenario that everyone dreamed of, but which few achieved. Those who were not lucky enough to have generous masters had to rely on their savings, which they had been putting aside all their lives. Butlers and cooks had a better chance of accumulating capital, opening their own shop or pub, and meeting old age with dignity. For junior staff who were paid pennies, saving for a comfortable old age was virtually impossible. Illness or injury could instantly wipe out all their savings. If they had no money and their health prevented them from working, the fate of a former servant was tragic. They faced poverty, dependence on relatives, or the most dreaded place in Victorian England, the workhouse. It was a prison-like institution where those who could not support themselves ended up. Being sent there was considered a disgrace worse than death, the final chord of a life ruined. Some older servants tried to find simpler jobs with lower requirements, but competition was fierce. They became watchmen, nurses, or did odd jobs for food. Their experience and manners acquired in wealthy homes seemed ridiculous in the slums, where they were often forced to move. They were fragments of a bygone glamour, cast aside to the margins of life. There were charitable societies set up to help elderly servants, but their resources were not enough for everyone. Joining such societies required lifetime contributions, which not everyone could afford. Those who were prudent received a modest pension that allowed them to survive. Loneliness was a frequent companion of old servants, as many of them had sacrificed their families for the sake of their careers. They had no children to take care of them. Their family was the staff of servants, which had already changed. They were left alone with their memories of other people's balls and other people's happiness. Their stories were rarely recorded. They left quietly and unnoticed, just as they had lived. Only occasionally did the name of an old nanny or faithful valet appear in the memoirs of aristocrats. They were the shadows of history, without whom that history could not have existed. The end of the era of large estates after World War I was a disaster for the servant class. Houses were closed, staff was reduced, and thousands of people found themselves unnecessary. It was the end of a whole world, cruel but understandable and orderly. The life of a Victorian servant was one of complete self-denial and hard work, often thankless. They gave their lives to create comfort for others, hoping for crumbs of gratitude at the end of the road. Their fates are a reminder of the social divide of that time. These were people whose hands built the greatness of the era, but whose names have been erased by time. Their fears and small joys remain forever within the walls of old mansions. We have peered behind the thick velvet curtains of the Victorian era and seen what was hidden behind the glitter of family silver. It was a life full of strict rules, exhausting labor, and constant psychological pressure, but also pride in one's craftsmanship. Each of these people, from the majestic butler to the downtrodden dishwasher, was part of a huge human mosaic. Which of these roles do you think was the most psychologically difficult? Was it the burden of responsibility of the butler, or the complete lack of rights of the dishwasher? Write your opinion in the comments. I'm very interested to hear what you think. And of course, subscribe to the channel so that we can continue to uncover the secrets of history together.